I came home from my cardiologist 2 hours early and found my son-in-law standing in my locked home office, holding a manila envelope addressed to my late wife's estate lawyer. He didn't hear me come in. The house was quiet the way it gets in February in Vancouver. That heavy, wet silence where even the rain outside sounds like it's trying not to disturb anything. I stood in the hallway for a moment, just watching him through the gap in the door. His back was to me. He was reading. Not skimming. Reading. Slowly. With the kind of focus you only use when the information matters to you personally. I said his name, Darius. He spun around so fast he knocked a framed photograph off the edge of my desk. It hit the floor face down. He didn't bend to pick it up. How does a man who shook your hand and called you dad at a wedding ceremony end up standing in your locked office, going through documents he was never meant to touch? If you've ever looked at someone your child chose and felt something cold move through your chest, not quite fear, not quite anger, something worse than both, then you already know what I felt in that doorway. I am a retired civil engineer. I spent 37 years working on infrastructure projects across British Columbia. Bridges, tunnels, drainage systems. The work taught me one thing above everything else. The cracks that bring a structure down are never the ones you can see from the outside. They're the ones hidden inside the load-bearing walls, invisible until the pressure gets high enough. By the time most people notice them, the damage is already done. I had noticed the cracks in Darius Whitmore the first evening my son brought him home for dinner. My son is Liam. He's 31 years old, a landscape architect working mostly in the North Shore area. He has his mother's eyes and her stubborn generosity, the kind that makes people feel immediately at ease around him, and unfortunately makes him easy to take advantage of. His mother, Vivienne, no, I'm sorry. My wife's name was Patricia. Patricia passed away 4 years ago from a pulmonary embolism, 6 days after what was supposed to be a routine knee replacement surgery. She was 61. She had a laugh that could fill a parking garage. The house has been quieter ever since in a way that no amount of noise ever quite covers. Liam was the one who told me he was gay when he was 24. He sat at the kitchen table exactly where I'd sat him down to help with math homework for 12 years, and told me like he was bracing for a building to fall on him. I told him I'd known since he was about 14, and I was glad he finally felt ready to say it out loud. We ordered pizza. It was a Thursday. When he brought Darius Whitmore home 8 months later, I made every effort. Darius was 33, originally from Toronto, worked in private wealth management at a firm downtown. He was polished in a way that took effort, the kind of effort you could only notice if you were paying close attention. Sharp dresser, good handshake. Excellent at asking questions that sounded like interest but functioned like reconnaissance. That first dinner, he asked about the house within the first 20 minutes. Not about the neighborhood, not about how long I'd lived there, about the house specifically. Square footage. Age of the roof. Whether the foundation was original. I answered pleasantly and watched his eyes move around the kitchen the way an assessor's eyes move around a kitchen. Not looking at the family photos on the refrigerator, not looking at the birthday cards still stuck to the bulletin board near the back door. Looking at the cabinetry, the countertops. The original fir floors Patricia and I had refinished together in 2009 during a 3-week stretch that nearly ended our marriage and is one of my favorite memories. I want to ask you something. If you were sitting at that dinner table, watching someone catalog the dimensions of your home while your son beamed at them across the salad bowl, what would you have done? Would you have said something and risked making Liam feel ambushed at his own coming-out dinner? Or would you have said nothing and started paying closer attention? I chose to pay closer attention. The morning after that dinner, I called Patricia's estate lawyer, a woman named Heather Yuen, who had handled our family's legal affairs for 15 years out of her office in Kitsilano. I told her I wanted to review the structure of everything. The house, the RRSP accounts, the TFSA, the small rental property in Kelowna that Patricia had inherited from her parents. I wanted to know exactly how exposed Liam, and by extension anyone Liam might bring into his life, might be to any of it. Patricia had been careful. She had been more financially careful than me, honestly. Years before she died, she had insisted on setting up a family trust to hold the major assets, the Kelowna property and the bulk of her life insurance payout, just under $800,000, sat inside that trust with clear conditions. Liam was the beneficiary, but he couldn't access the principal until he turned 38. She wanted him to build something of his own first. She used to say the worst thing you could do for someone you loved was make it too easy. The house I lived in was my personal property, not in the trust. That was something I addressed after that first dinner. I called Heather and we restructured. The house went into a separate holding arrangement that made it effectively impossible to access without a lengthy probate process that would be on public record and fully auditable. I didn't tell Liam, not because I didn't trust him, because I knew that anything I told Liam, in his generosity, might mention to Darius. And I had learned, from 37 years of engineering, that you don't advertise the load-bearing walls to the person who seems interested in knowing where the weaknesses are. Liam and Darius got engaged 2 years after that first dinner. I smiled in every photograph. I paid for the rehearsal dinner at a restaurant on Granville Island that Patricia would have loved. I gave a toast that made Liam cry. I meant every word of it. What I did not do was disclose at any point that I had quietly hired a background research firm, a legitimate one, used frequently by HR departments and financial institutions, to do a professional workup on Darius Whitmore. What they found was not criminal, but it was instructive. Darius had been in 2 previous long-term relationships before Liam. The first had ended after 2 years when his partner, a software developer in his late 30s with a condo in Liberty Village, had discovered that Darius had been accessing his online banking to monitor his account balances. Not transferring anything, just watching. The partner had found out by accident when a notification went to the wrong device. Darius had explained it away as concern, as wanting to make sure they were financially aligned. The partner hadn't pressed charges, he'd just ended the relationship. The second had ended similarly. A man in his early 40s, divorced, owned a small business. Darius had pushed, over 18 months, to be added to various accounts and assets in the name of building a future together. When the man had consulted a lawyer, which Darius apparently hadn't anticipated, the relationship had ended within weeks. I read all of this in a discreet 12-page report on a Tuesday afternoon. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat with it for a long time. I did not tell Liam. I know how that sounds. Believe me, in the years since, I have turned that decision over many times. But Liam was the happiest I had seen him since his mother's funeral. He was glowing in a way that grief had taken from him for a long time. I had no proof of anything criminal. I had a pattern, and I knew, from watching my own father interfere in my older brother's marriage based on nothing more than a gut feeling and a general disapproval of his wife's family, that the fastest way to permanently damage your relationship with your child is to attack the person they love before they're ready to see what you see. So I did something else instead. I made sure the walls were reinforced before the pressure came. Heather helped me structure a prenuptial agreement that was presented to both Liam and Darius by our family legal team, as standard practice for any marriage involving a family trust of this nature. It was framed as protecting Liam, not as suspicion of Darius. Darius pushed back. He called it insulting. He told Liam it was a sign that his father had never accepted their relationship. Liam came to me, hurt, and asked me if that was true. I sat down with my son and I told him the truth, the partial truth. I told him that the trust existed to protect what his mother had built, that it had been her explicit wish, and that the legal team had advised the prenup tune-up as a protective measure for both of them. I told him I liked Darius just fine. I told him I wanted him to be happy. Darius signed the agreement 3 weeks before the wedding. I have no doubt he signed it believing he could find another way in. The marriage itself was a beautiful event. They held it at a vineyard in the Okanagan in late August. Liam wore a cream suit. Darius wore charcoal. I danced with my son to a song Patricia had loved. I don't cry in public as a general rule, but I was close. For the first 14 months, things were quiet. Liam and Darius were living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Mount Pleasant that Liam had owned outright since before they met. Darius's firm had transferred him to a smaller client services role. A lateral move, he said, that would open up new opportunities. He seemed genuinely content, or performed contentment convincingly enough that I began to wonder if I had been wrong about him. Then Liam's 31st birthday passed, and something shifted. I noticed it at Christmas. Darius had started asking casually about my health. Not in the way a person asks when they're concerned, in the way a person asks when they're calculating. He mentioned a friend whose elderly parent had developed memory issues and asked whether I'd considered having a power of attorney set up. He mentioned that he'd been reading about estate planning and wondered aloud whether my arrangements were current. He mentioned twice in one evening that the Kelowna real estate market had gone absolutely insane, and what a shame it would be to have an asset like that sitting idle. I listened to all of it. I said very little. I watched Liam not notice any of it because he was busy being generous and happy and completely present with the people he loved, the way Patricia had raised him to be. In February, Darius began suggesting that the 3 of us should get on the same page about long-term planning. He used that phrase repeatedly. Same page. He had a gift for corporate language that made exploitation sound collaborative. He suggested a family financial meeting where we could align on goals. When I declined warmly, without giving a reason, he started going around me. He suggested to Liam that maybe his dad was getting forgetful, that it might be time to think about whether I could manage the house on my own much longer. Liam, to his enormous credit, told Darius that his father was one of the sharpest people he knew and to drop it. Darius dropped the subject with Liam. He did not drop it in his own mind. The cardiology appointment was real. I have a mild arrhythmia that's been monitored for years. It's managed, it's stable, it's not particularly dramatic, but it gives me a legitimate reason to see specialists at VGH every 6 to 8 weeks. On the day in question, the clinic had a scheduling conflict and my appointment was rescheduled to the following week. I was home by 11 in the morning. I had left the office locked, as always. I keep it locked not because I have secrets. I keep it locked because it contains Patricia's files, her handwritten notes from the years she worked as a community pharmacist, her correspondence with her own lawyer about the trust, cards Liam made her in elementary school. It is not a vault. It's a room where she still exists in paper form, and I am not interested in having it casually wandered through. Darius had a key to the front door. Liam had given him one. He apparently used that key to come in, go to the office door, which uses a standard deadbolt, and, based on what I observed, either had a copy made of that key at some previous point when it had been left unattended, or had used a bump technique. I'm not an expert on lock manipulation. I am an expert on the fact that he was standing in my office holding documents that were none of his business. I said his name. He turned around, the photograph fell. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. In that silence, I noticed the specific folders he had been going through. Patricia's original trust documentation, the correspondence from Heather's office dating back 7 years, and a sealed envelope that Patricia had left, with a handwritten note on the outside that said, simply, "For Liam, when he needs to remember." That envelope was the thing I had been guarding most carefully. Not the financial documents. Those were essentially impenetrable anyway. The envelope. I walked across the room. I picked up the photograph from the floor. It was Patricia and Liam at his university graduation, her hand on his shoulder, both of them laughing at something off camera, and I set it back on the desk facing the right direction. I gathered the folders from beside Darius's hands without touching him. I put them back in the cabinet. I locked it. "Get out of my house," I said. My voice was completely level. I have never once in my life been able to produce that sound when I was actually calm. But somehow, in the moments when it matters most, the voice goes quiet and steady all on its own. Darius tried. He told me Liam had asked him to check on the house. He told me he'd found the door unlocked. He told me he was just looking for a document Liam had mentioned. 3 lies in under 30 seconds, each one calibrated to see which would stick. I let all 3 land on the floor between us without picking any of them up. He left. I sat in the office for 2 hours. I looked at Patricia's photograph on the desk. I thought about what she would have said, what she would have done, how she would have handled the conversation with Liam that I now needed to have. She had always been better at those conversations than me. She could hold someone's heart in her hands while she told them a hard truth. I tend to put things down too quickly. The next morning, I drove to Mount Pleasant. Liam buzzed me in without asking who it was, which told me Darius had called him the night before and that he was expecting this. When I came through the apartment door, Liam was standing in the kitchen. He looked exhausted. Darius was sitting on the couch with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has already written the narrative and is simply waiting for the other person to deliver their lines incorrectly. I sat down in the chair across from them. I kept my jacket on. I looked at Darius. "You broke into my office," I said. Darius exhaled through his nose in a way designed to communicate that he found me tiresome. "I didn't break into anything, Gordon. You need to think about the language you're using here." He had always called me Gordon. Never Dad, which I had not encouraged, but also never something warmer. Always Gordon, with a slight emphasis that managed to be both familiar and dismissive simultaneously. "Did you ask Liam to check on the house yesterday?" I asked. Darius's jaw shifted slightly. I asked him if someone could. "Liam." I turned to my son. "Did you ask Darius to go to the house?" Liam's eyes moved to the floor. "No," he said quietly. Darius leaned forward. "This is exactly what you do," he said, his voice climbing toward the register where people go when they realize they're losing. "You have spent 4 years trying to undermine our relationship. You have never accepted us. You use the trust, you use the lawyers, you use everything you have to keep Liam financially dependent on your approval. You call it protection, it's control." I waited for him to finish. Then I said, "The trust Patricia established holds assets worth approximately $1.1 million. The house is held separately and is not part of the trust. You signed a prenuptial agreement that excludes you from both. You have known this since before the wedding. What you were looking for yesterday was something that would change that calculation. You didn't find it, because there's nothing there that would. But I want Liam to hear me say clearly, in front of you, I know what you were looking for, and I know why." The room went very quiet. Darius turned to Liam. He pivoted immediately, as skilled manipulators do, away from the confrontation he was losing and toward the relationship he could still try to use. Liam, you're going to let him talk to your husband like this? He just accused me of. He didn't break into the house, Liam said. The sentence came out flat, not angry, just flat, like a door closing. Liam, he doesn't have a key to the office. Liam set his coffee mug down. I've never had a key to the office. So don't tell me you found the door open. Darius looked at Liam for a long moment. What I was watching, I realized, was Darius recalculating, running the numbers on a situation that was no longer moving in his direction. I had seen that expression before in board meetings, in city council presentations, in every room where someone suddenly realizes that the structure they were counting on is not going to hold their weight. I want to see the trust documents, Liam said. He was looking at me now, all of them. I want to understand what Mom set up. Darius said, Liam, I really think we should. I wasn't asking you, Liam said. We drove to the house in separate cars. It was still February, still raining, that particular Vancouver rain that isn't dramatic, just constant and gray and patient. When we pulled into the driveway, Liam sat in his car for a minute before coming in. I waited on the front step without rushing him. Inside, I led him down the hallway to the office. I typed in the code, Patricia's birthday, the 14th of March, and the deadbolt disengaged. We went in. I pulled the trust documents from the cabinet and set them on the desk. But before I handed them to him, I reached to the back of the bottom shelf and took out the sealed envelope. For Liam, when he needs to remember. Your mother wrote this about 2 months before she died, I told him. She asked me to keep it until you were in genuine trouble. I'm sorry it took this long. I handed it to him and walked to the window. The backyard was brown and wet, the garden beds covered in burlap for the winter. I knew what Patricia had written. I had read it once, the night after the funeral, and I hadn't opened it since. She had written about her own parents, about watching her mother trust the wrong person and lose a house she'd lived in for 30 years. She had written about Liam's heart, about how it was the best thing about him, and also the thing most likely to be used against him. She had written about what real love looked like from the inside, and how to tell the difference between someone who was building a life with you and someone who was building a position. She had also written something that I heard from the window in Liam's voice cracking. The person who loves you for real will never need to know what you're worth. They'll just know you. He was quiet for a long time after that. Eventually he set the letter down on the desk and looked at the trust documents. He read slowly, the way he reads everything, carefully, completely. When he finished, he said, 22 months ago I paid off his student loans, $43,000. He told me it was going to free us up to save together. I didn't say anything. He hasn't contributed to the joint account since August. Liam closed the folder. I thought he was just in a rough patch at work. I thought he stopped. He looked at the window, not at me. I thought he was embarrassed. The sound in his voice during those words, that specific sound, is the one I cannot describe without feeling it again. It's the sound of someone realizing the story they've been living, and the story they were actually in are two different stories. I had hoped he would never have to make that sound in my presence. But I think Patricia knew he might. I think that's why she wrote the letter. The final conversation at the Mount Pleasant apartment happened the following Saturday morning. Liam had spent the week reviewing 5 years of joint financial records, which he had requested from the bank on his own, without telling Darius. He had also, quietly, spoken to Heather, and Heather had referred him to a family lawyer who handles divorces. I drove him to the apartment. I waited in the car. He was inside for 40 minutes. He told me later that when he walked in, Darius started in immediately, a prepared speech about communication and family pressure, and how Liam had let his father come between them. Liam waited for him to finish. Then he opened his laptop and turned it so Darius could see the screen. I went through everything, Liam told him. Flat voice. The same flat voice from the living room. The joint account. The credit card. The line of credit you took out in both our names 8 months ago that I didn't know about until last Tuesday. $43,000 for your loans. $1,800 a month since March on your car. The gym. The trips you told me were for work. He looked at him. I'm not angry at myself for trusting you. You worked very hard to earn that trust. But I'm done now. Darius, by Liam's account, tried 4 separate things. Denial, then minimization, then tears, then threats. He mentioned speaking to a lawyer about what he was entitled to as a spouse. Liam told him that was absolutely his right and gave him Heather's number so his attorney could contact her directly. The prenuptial agreement, Heather later confirmed, was essentially airtight. Darius's lawyer reviewed it and recommended settling. The divorce was final in 4.5 months. Darius left the apartment, which had been Liam's separate property before the marriage, with his personal belongings and a settlement that covered exactly what the prenup specified, which was nothing from the trust and nothing from Liam's premarital assets. He moved back to Toronto. Liam told me this in passing, the way you mentioned something that has already stopped mattering. The spring came, which it always does in Vancouver eventually, and always feels slightly miraculous when it happens. The burlap came off the garden beds in April. I replanted Patricia's rose bushes along the back fence, a project I'd been putting off for 3 years because it felt like too much of a decision to make alone. Liam started coming for dinner on Sundays again, which he had done less of in the Darius years without me ever commenting on it. In June he brought someone. He was apologetic about it in the way he is apologetic about everything. Preemptively, slightly too much. He said he hadn't wanted to say anything too early because he didn't want to make it a thing. But her name was Bridget. She was 34. She worked as an occupational therapist at a children's rehabilitation center on the North Shore. And she drove a 12-year-old Subaru that she'd bought used and was clearly fond of. She came in through the front door, and the first thing she did, before she said anything to me, was look at the row of photographs on the hallway wall. She pointed to one. Liam at about 7 years old, gap-toothed, holding a fish he'd caught at a lake in the interior with Patricia's hand visible at the edge of the frame. "Is that him?" she asked. "That's him," I said. She laughed like she meant it. "He looks exactly the same. We had roast chicken." She asked how long I'd lived in the house. I told her 31 years. She asked if the floors were original fur. I told her yes, that Patricia and I had refinished them ourselves. She said they were beautiful. She said it while looking at the floors, not while calculating anything. There's a difference. I have learned, over many years, to know the difference. After dinner, Liam and I stepped out to the back porch while Bridget, who had insisted, finished washing up. The garden was in bloom. Patricia's roses had come back better than I'd expected. Big, messy, not quite symmetrical, exactly the way she'd liked them. I poured 2 small glasses from a bottle of BC Red that had been sitting in the cabinet for an occasion I hadn't named yet. Liam stood next to me looking at the yard for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I told him there was nothing to be sorry for, I meant it. "You knew," he said. "Not an accusation, just a fact." "I suspected," I said. "Knowing takes longer." He was quiet. The light was doing the thing it does in Vancouver in early summer, staying gold and sideways long past when it should. Bridget's voice carried through the kitchen window, talking to herself while she stacked the dishes, not performing anything for anyone. "She asked me what Mom's favorite song was," Liam said. "On our second date, just because she wanted to know." I looked at the roses. Patricia used to say that the best test of a person's character wasn't how they behaved when something was at stake. It was how they behaved when nothing was. When there was no audience, no gain, no angle. Just the ordinary moments that make up most of a life. She called it the dark room test. She said, "Find out who someone is when the lights are off." I had kept the study locked for years, not as a fortress, not out of suspicion, though at times it had served both purposes, but because some things are not for everyone. Some things belong to the people who earned them. The room holds Patricia's files, her handwriting, her voice in every careful sentence she wrote when she still had time to write. It holds the letter that reached Liam when he needed it most, exactly as she'd intended. The office stays locked. The code is still March 14th, but it doesn't feel like a locked room anymore. It feels like a room full of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I want to hear from you. If you think I handled this the right way, protecting my son from the outside while waiting for him to find his own way to the truth, leave a 1 in the comments. If you think I should have told Liam everything I knew from the beginning and trusted him to handle it, leave a 2. And if you think Darius got off too easy and should have faced real legal consequences, leave a 3, because honestly, there are days I agree with you. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I mean that sincerely. There is something about knowing that someone in Halifax or Winnipeg, or somewhere I've never been, is sitting with this story at 11 o'clock at night that makes it feel less like a thing that happened to me, and more like a thing that might matter to someone else. If someone in your life has ever treated your family's trust as a resource to be extracted rather than a relationship to be built, share what happened in the comments. Other people need to know what the early signs look like. They need to know it before the damage is done, not after. This is a fictional story built on real emotional truths, rewritten and reimagined to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.